My mother was very down on guitars, so electric guitars were really out of it because they were going to be more expensive. They were going to be too noisy, but I coveted them forever. When you realize that the Beatles were doing a lot with acoustic guitars, it was really, really exciting. I studied them even later, the more I went back in time, kind of in reverse, and realized, gee, they were doing even more than I thought, and it was more influential than I thought, so I could even have felt better about acoustic guitars at that point.
Yeah, even songs that aren't straight up acoustic songs, you can hear it in there as sort of texture. A song like A Hard Day's Night, it's almost percussive. The strumming of the strings, it's very rhythmic what Lennon's doing on that. And you hear that a lot through their stuff, just like you would with The Who. We know that Townsend's demos were the basis for a lot of Who recordings, but a song like Won't Get Fooled Again, what's there an acoustic doing there? But there it is.
Yes, there's nothing like that sound. And it is, as you're saying, it is really, really basic and important and fundamental to the Beatles sound. How many of their songs, even with lots of electric guitar, are acoustic-driven rhythm? And, again, it's a real nod to the genius of John Lennon that he was so amazing at that. And it's really fun to listen to what he's doing because, as we'll even talk about later, he was always interested in things not being boring. It was always interesting to hear the Beatles that they were actually talking as artists to each other. They didn't sound like artists. They would use very basic language. Well, this almost doesn't get boring. We can keep, that kind of feeling.
Right.
And that's the way he played. He would change it up and do little interesting things. And all the Beatles would do that. But John, particularly in his rhythm parts, he's always keeping them interesting. He's always keeping them just amazingly driving the music. And, that also comes from, I think, the Beatles hilariously in the beginning didn't have a drummer, and they were always trying to get booked without a drummer.
Right.
And everybody would always say, well, where's the drummer? And they would go, the rhythms and the guitars.
Exactly. I was having that thought there because that was, I think, really a building block to the Beatles' sound is they're compensating for the lack of a drummer and really emphasizing the rhythm with that 3-guitar lineup they had.
That's exactly right. They were always compensating for the fact that they were struggling from the very beginning, and it just made them think at every moment in a song what they can do and how to make it interesting. And then part of the genius of it is they didn't overdo it. They just had that perfect touch about just what to add and what not to add, what to do and what not to do. And it was just amazing, and that was part of the chemistry they had with each other.
Yeah, for sure. We've said on the show before about deprivation being the mother of invention and how it leads to innovation when you're trying to compensate for some perceived lack. But as you describe, with Lennon playing things differently each pass in a given song, changing his part. We've talked about Ringo doing that. It's that attention to detail that makes these recordings so enduring because there's always something fresh to find in them, especially when you're a band like the Beatles where everybody who's a fan is close to listening anyway.
That's so right. I mean, because you think, how many times can I listen to the Beatles in all these years? And you're always finding something new or always getting excited about something new. And it has been in the last few years. I've just been kind of concentrating more on Lennon's acoustic guitar rhythm playing and just saying, wow, because if you're not really listening closely when you first hear it, there's a rhythm guitar keeping time. And it's like, no, that's not what's happening. He's doing all kinds of interesting things. At any point that the song needs something, at any point it gets a little bit quieter, that needs a little bit of a change, he's there. He's there with something. And of course, you could say that about any of them in any part anywhere. But I just became really interested recently because I played, everyone's so interested in my own musical background, I'm sure. I played, first this Kingston Trio stuff. Also, there was bluegrass music in there with the Flatt & Scruggs and the Dillards, and obviously the Dylan stuff. There was a certain amount of strumming involved in that. But then I became very, very interested in finger picking because that's where the James Taylor stuff went, and that's where the later Beatles stuff went. And so that was really when I was really developing as a guitar player, and I got very, very into just always finger picking and doing very, very little strumming. And all the guitars I bought were designed for finger picking, which cedar top guitars, which are much more sensitive. You literally can't really strum on them because it overwhelms the wood in the top. For great strumming, you want the Sitka spruce and stuff like that. So I wasn't really that concentrating on that. I was playing that kind of music for a while. And then I came across completely by accident. I was at Peter Asher's house one evening, and we were playing music, and he just handed me one of his guitars, which happened to be a Gibson J200, which we'll talk about. That's what George got toward the end of the Beatles. Mm-hmm. And I just strummed it once, and it was the most amazing strumming guitar you can ever buy. It's literally called the King of Flat Tops because it's the biggest acoustic guitar you can get. There isn't really a bigger one that I've ever been aware of. So it has this amazing low end. And because it has maple back and sides, that particular wood is very bright. So you have a great high end and a low end, and it's just killer. And you've just heard it on everything, this guitar. This was actually the guitar that Peter used a lot on a lot of Linda Ronstadt sessions. So when you hear the jangling acoustic guitar on those things, and that's this J200.
You're expressing something that I've never really heard anybody talk about in terms of an acoustic guitar. One particular style is good for acoustic picking, finger picking, and the other for strumming, making that distinction. Is this something you think the Beatles were aware of early on, or is it more the circumstances of what guitar they could afford at any given time, and maybe they got a little bit more nuanced about it as, their wherewithal to make these sort of decisions developed?
They would have a tendency to accidentally discover things. And they all had like genius ears. I mean, George Harrison, genius ears, and obviously John and Paul. And the beginning was very, very budget based. And, they had to buy their guitars on time, on purchase hire, as they called it over there, and got those J160Es. And, it's kind of interesting. Throughout their career, they made the best music in the world on really middling instruments. They weren't absolutely the top of the crop instruments, but because the Beatles are genius players, it didn't matter. They made them sound better than anything could ever sound. And arguably, those instruments did sound the best they possibly could. It's just that they weren't that easy to play. They weren't, you could get instruments that were better made and easier to play than they had at the very beginning. And that, again, as you're saying, the necessity of the mother of invention, they became better players because of that.
Right.
But the J160E, though, was also a guitar. When I saw that as a kid, it was the perfect thing because being an acoustic guitar player, you saw those two knobs on the body, and it was an electric guitar and it was an acoustic guitar. So it was everything you could ever want. And the Beatles had it. My mother, because I had abandoned the piano, which was very expensive for us and for her at the time, we were struggling, she never believed I would really get serious about the guitar. So she would never spend a lot of money on any of the guitars that she got me. And so they were always about $100. They'd be great for about 2 months, and then they would just warp like you wouldn't believe. I mean, I could fit in between the strings and the fretboard and just take a nap there if I wanted to just get ridiculous. But yeah, the J160E, which, I eventually, it was funny when I finally got to actually get and hold and play the Beatles instruments, not the actual Beatles instruments, but, versions of them. I was amazed at how, kind of basic they were and not easy. And I think I mentioned before that 12-string Rickenbacker is particularly insanely difficult to play.
Right.
And which makes George's playing just even more stunning, in that way. But yeah, they would come across things. And in fact, probably our second acoustic song that we're talking about that was really huge in my mind for the Beatles was Till There Was You. And, where Love Me Do is technically an acoustic song. Again, we're not going to nitpick about the bass using electricity, but it's just an acoustic guitar, bass, and drums and a harmonica. But Till There Was You, they would do that live with electric instruments. But when it came to recording it, it became a completely acoustic number.
Right.
And that was George's Ramirez guitar, which was given to him by Klaus Forman. And it was when you were asking about how they wound up with these instruments, the Beatles, somebody would have one, they would play it, and they go, this is great. And this sounds really interesting, and I really want to get into classical guitar. And then because they were Beatles and friends, Klaus would go, okay, you can have it. And that's how George got that guitar.
Now, there is a distinction when you talk about the J160E in the way they would implement them in the studio between them being mic'd or played through the pickups and through amplification. So when you say that John's definitely using one here, that would be an example of being mic'd, right?
Yes, almost all the time you're hearing that jangly rhythm sound. It's mic'd. And they would use these Neumann mics that they had, which are so hard to find now, and nothing sounds like them. They really can't make the mics the way they used to. Neumann KM54s or KM56s. They would also use U47s and 48s. And then later, much later, it would go transistor with a U67. And that's generally the way they would record acoustic guitar for the Beatles with these mics.
So is that what you hear on This Boy or If I Fell?
That's right. That's what you're hearing.
Okay.
And, it sounds really good for what it was. It's like these were excellent microphones and they picked up everything those guitars could give. If you tried to use the pickup on a J160, it was a kind of a magnetic pickup. It's not good. First, it's fairly noisy. And second, it's very muddy. It doesn't really sound. It neither sounds acoustic or electric. It's just in an area that's terrible for both.
Right. It turns it into a different instrument.
It does. It's not a good sound. And I'm not sure, where the Beatles have actually ever used those guitars, in a recording where it's actually going through an amp. Nothing ever jumped out at me. I mean, I guess I could deeply research that. But
I Feel Fine would be one example.
I Feel Fine is a great example of that feedback coming from the J160.
Right. Have you seen the footage of the Enemy show where John's got it on stage?
Yes, I have seen that. Yeah.
And then that's what he's playing I Feel Fine on. And I think it's pretty much established that that's what he used on the record, although running it through the amp, as opposed to the way he'd used it previously to that point as a straight-up acoustic guitar.
Right, and that is absolutely something that happens. If you leave one of these guitars lying around, and it's the same today with any guitar that had kind of acoustic guitar that has a pickup inside, you'll get a great feedback loop. And I remember hearing that on the record for the first time and actually mentioning that to my much older brother, who was an engineer at the time. And I said, what's this sound on this record? And he says, it sounds like some sort of horrible distortion. They must have made some sort of mistake. You literally in those days couldn't even comprehend that kind of sound would be purposely put on a record.
Right. Wait till The Who came along.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that was just a couple of years later. Everything changed. But at that point, it was one of the weirdest things you ever heard, was to hear that. And it really, I remember playing it a bunch of times and going, no, it's not a mistake because it's in tune. It's a mistake that's in tune with the song.
Right. And such was their genius to take that as a sort of diversionary tactic off a song that's clearly derived from other songs that came before. Famously Watch Your Step by Bobby Parker, but also What I'd Say, Ray Charles. It's in that line. You can include some other guy in there as well. And by throwing that at listeners first, your ears take a different path than automatically thinking, oh, well, this is just son of, these other songs. So it's pretty clever on their part.
Well, it was endless with them. It was just anything they came across, they figured a way to put it in to their music in a really, not a superfluous way, but a really creative way. And
yes, a way that made some kind of musical sense, and it wasn't gratuitous.
It's true. You hear that song now, and it doesn't sound gratuitous. It doesn't sound dated. It just sounds like a cool beginning to a song.
Yep. It's fantastic.
It was amazing that they got those J160Es because it did lead to like that feedback and whatever sounds that were kind of different that they got from those guitars. And they also work great as acoustic guitars. An interesting fact about a J160E is that according to George Harrison, that is the only instrument that is present on every single Beatles album. It's the only one that made it from the very beginning to the very end.
That's very interesting.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, you'd mentioned the other Gibson acoustic before, the 200 that you see him playing with in the latter days of the Beatles.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm assuming that might be the Here Comes the Sun guitar.
That is the Here Comes the Sun guitar, yes.
Yeah, and then I think he gave one to Dylan because you see him playing that one or holding it on the cover of, what is it, New Morning?
Nashville Skyline.
Is it Nashville? Okay, yeah. I know it's one of those circa 70 albums of his, and lo and behold, there it is, the one that you see in pictures of George from the Let It Be sessions, like playing For You Blue on that instrument.
That's exactly right. I don't know where George got the guitar. I guess he just chose it around the time that a little later after Lennon and McCartney both got their Martin D28s.
Now, those are the ones in Rishikesh?
Those are the ones. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. They brought those to India. They got those not long before that. They got those like, right when you see it used in Hello, Goodbye. I think that's the first time you see those guitars.
Right.
And they brought them to India. And, again, we're jumping around, but, when we get to the White Album, that really is probably the biggest acoustic explosion.
Right.
Because you have virtually every song on there done acoustically on those Escher tapes at George's house.
Right. And I was thinking Across the Universe as well.
Across the Universe as well, which was tried with the entire band. And, there's different versions. And my favorite version of Across the Universe is the full acoustic version that's on Anthology, which was an early take, and they kept working on it for a long time after that. But that early take is really stunning.
Yes, I agree, because we've got several different versions to choose from now. We've got that one, we've got Let It Be Naked, we've got the Spectre one, we've got the Wildlife Fund one. Yeah, that one seems the purest, and it's at the same time it's interesting that their approach ultimately was so stripped down for those early takes before they started getting carried away with the embellishments. They kind of took it away from where it needed to go.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's arguments for each version. I mean, that early version in Anthology does not have that cool harmony, over the chorus.
Yeah.
And you miss that a little bit, but it's also fun to sing that yourself. So you actually can do a true duet, not over them, but with them in that way.
Unfinished music.
Exactly. So it's a little karaoke thing for you. And,
right.
But yeah, the other things, they bring in, there's a little bit of electric instrumentation in those, and because it's such an organic song and everything, I'm such an acoustic guy that I get excited about the way it was originally, and I also think it's also a great test of a song that when it works with very simple instrumentation, it just shows you the strength of the song.
Yes, exactly. I think about, something that relies heavily on production, like a Tomorrow Never Knows, I think still works when you're, banging away on the one chord throughout, because the lyrics are so compelling. It still feels like it's going somewhere. Even something as sort of monolithic as that. The production's great, but it still works. Strawberry Field's a great example of a song. It's just exquisite, played on a solo acoustic, but then they turned it into something sublime with George Martin's production touches.
Yeah, that is the bonus of the Beatles is the songs often work incredibly simplistically with just an acoustic guitar. I Am the Walrus is the same way. It's hilariously fantastic, just solo acoustic. It's got enough going on, and it's got this great descending bass line, and it just sounds incredibly dark and funny and on the acoustic guitar, and the lyrics are just so incredible. But yet, what they did with it production-wise only improved it and brought it to a completely new level. So it works in both ways because it's such a great song and they're such brilliant producers.
Right, which is incredibly satisfying. Now, to circle back a little bit, we were talking a little bit about Till There Was You and George playing a Spanish guitar on that. What I found very interesting the first time I heard the Decca audition, where he does it, and it's an electric performance, and he does two solos in it. The second one's a little lackluster. But he's got the same solo that he would record in the fall of '63 and the one subsequently performed live on the Ed Sullivan Show. He's got it down. And it makes you wonder, at what point did he come up with this arrangement? Because it's clearly locked down. It's not one of these solos that he improvises. It's a little bit different every time he plays it, like I Saw Her Standing There. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Well, it definitely was a song that seems to come out of, the need to play all these other covers to cover, an 8-hour day
right.
of playing music. And so, yeah, it seems like they've been playing it for a very long time, and it makes complete sense that he's really good on it because I'm sure they did it hundreds of times before they finally recorded it.
Yeah, and they recognize the presentation value of it when you're playing before sort of a mixed audience. I can't imagine it got played much at the Cavern, but there it is before the Royals. There it is at Decca. There it is on the Sullivan Show. It's a great piece that if you're trying to, expand your audience a bit, oh, well, how bad can they be? They're playing this from the Music Man, and they're playing it well.
I know, that blew me away from the very beginning. And if I was an older person at the time instead of a little kid, I would have been so impressed by that because they were saying, that music is music. We can embrace everything and do every kind of style. We can sound like a punk band, which is before punk, but they did sound like that at the Cavern often.
Oh, yeah.
And we can also do this, that's just a stunning range and versatility. Like right away, you're sitting up and taking notice that these guys are true musicians, that they can do anything. And they also understand music completely. And they realize there's no real limitation to good. Good can be this and good can be that. It doesn't have to be just one thing. And that's incredibly powerful and incredibly early and incredibly ballsy to do that.
Yeah, incredibly smart and just such a canny move. I mean, on the one hand, it could be seen as self-serving to want to win over anybody that's skeptical that's watching it, but I think it's a little bit more pure than that it just showed who these guys were, that we can take, a Peggy Lee song, from a Broadway musical and turn it into something, make it our own without replicating it utterly. The same way they took the Coasters, Besame Mucho, which went back to the 40s. Here's this Latin number that they turn into this raucous rock and roll showpiece when they're playing at the Star Club. So music was music to them. It was good. It was good. They could take it and make it their own, and it didn't matter where it came from.
That's exactly right. I mean, the fact that they would just look at something and turn it into something for them. And of course, there might have been some calculation there. I mean, there's always a certain amount, but you can't really fool an audience beyond a certain point. And that even goes to like talking about somebody like Spielberg. It's like, he does these movies that are so center cut. They were, at his absolute peak, they were so down the straight and narrow, and just everybody loved them. But it wasn't done cynically, to try and get the largest audience. That just happened to be his sensibility. He truly loved what it was that he was making and doing, particularly in the beginning. And that's the same thing that we certainly know this about McCartney, is that McCartney just loves music. And he doesn't care what it is as long as it's good. Mm-hmm. And he has no boundaries in his thinking. As to say, oh, he's so schmaltzy, and then he does Helter Skelter, or he does For No One, which is just killer, nasty stuff. And Eleanor Rigby. So this is just a guy that just loves good music. And that was a huge influence to the entire group. Even if they kind of groused about it at times, he would pull them in that direction, and then Lennon be pulling them in another direction. And it was just this, again, the way the Beatles again and again, it's like this perfect coming together of these minds that just, really, really influenced and made each other grow. So Sgt. Pepper is one of the greatest collection of happy sounds that has ever come from the human race. I mean, that's one of the reasons, and that goes along with the cover, which is an explosion of color and all those people on it that you like or have a response to. And you see the old Beatles and the new Beatles. It's very comforting. It's kind of taking you along, even though that in itself looks a bit like a funeral. The Beatles on the cover of Sgt. Pepper, the original Beatles, the wax figures, they look so sad. I was always amazed that they look exactly like they are at a funeral, and they're quite upset. But, in general, that album is so happy, and Revolver is much more of a challenging thing. But I was so grateful for Tomorrow Never Knows because it pulled me forward. When I first heard it, I wasn't sure. But the more you listen to it, they taught you and you learned, and then you were ready to hear new things. Your ears had opened up, your heart had opened up, and your mind had opened up. And that was what was so great about this group, is they just were so interested in not sounding like they did in the album before or even on the song before. And that's a big, big Lennon thing, too, because, as you know, his own tendency was to always blow up everything he did before. He'd say, oh, we're really proud of Pepper. And then, 6 months later, that's the biggest load of shit we ever did. He would, and that, that was his artistic bent, which was to always move forward. And sadly, to eventually say, well, I got to be out of the Beatles now, too, because that's also, too much of the same thing for me.
Right. An early clue to the new direction. That's what they were all about.
That's right. It kind of works out perfectly that right at the end of Revolver, of course, was the first song recorded. They're saying it's the end of the beginning. This is the end of the beginning, and it was. It's like they marked that. That's the weird thing that the Beatles would accidentally, but sort of perfectly, mark parts of their career unconsciously, and then the last song that they ever released and everything is called The End. The Abbey Road says goodbye to you as it is saying goodbye to you. It's insane.
Right. And just the fact that they're counting it off as they're echoing their debut, which was a mere 3 years before with Taxman. It's like, what a long, strange trip it's been to bring us to this point. But that is the exact turnstile between the performing years and the studio years there with the Revolver album.
It's incredible. It's incredible in that it comes out in the lyrics and the feel of it. But I think I think it is interesting. Somebody could go through and do this because it's definitely a good use of your time. I think that the amount of death in Revolver beats any other album they ever did.
Yeah,
right. Because even
question.
Taxman has a death joke in it as well.
Right.
So it's like so many songs are reminding you you're going to die, which is generally the opposite goal of entertainment. Entertainment is supposed to make you forget that you're going to die, and you're always being very challenged if the entertainment is doing the opposite.
Leave it to the Beatles to be counterintuitive.
Exactly.
So it's an interesting thing, too, when we're tracing their use of acoustic instruments and how very early on, as they're getting comfortable in the studio and maybe selling out enough records that they can take their time and experiment a little bit, how their initial approach in a song may change as they're sort of making their way through it and divining what is the optimum way to present this. We've got the foundation of a good song here, but what do we need to do to really elevate it? And one of the early ones comes during the Hard Day's Night sessions where they do that initial 12-string electric version of And I Love Her before that gets transformed utterly.
That's right. And again, the genius of them to hear a song, play it, and then so quickly fix it and turn it into something iconic. It's really interesting. You'll hear it and go, well, that's a good song, but it sort of sounds like other things in the time, and there's nothing particularly about it that stands out. And then they figure out 4 or 5 things that would stand out in the song, make it iconic, and make it like nothing else. And also the fearlessness. They're so identified with the electric guitars. I mean, I know there's a lot of pictures of them with the J160Es, which are sort of electric, but mostly it's the electric guitar look. And to go, no, we don't have to do that. We can sound acoustic, and we can make acoustic songs. And I Love Her is a great example. And when you hear the differences of the first approach with the big drums too,
right?
I think you have to have drums and everything, and not be afraid to lose that and go with non-rock and roll percussion. Absolutely.
As we now know through the Scorsese doc that it was George who came up with the riff this whole song hangs on.
Absolutely. And he did that so often.
Yeah, that great solo, so beautifully shot by Dick Lester in Hard Day's Night.
Yes, it's great to see that in A Hard Day's Night. We can actually get into some of the videos that lie to you about the instruments being used. Sometimes the Beatles would lie.
Yes, in the opening moments of Ringo entering If I Fell comes to mind.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that movie was more accurate than usual. There are a lot of things that are very misleading for one reason or another other places, but I give that one pretty high marks for some accuracy. As Keith Richards and the Stones said, the Beatles were 4 separate frontmen who happened to come together in a band and amazingly loved each other and stayed together for as long as they did with all that talent among them. And as we know, George became a songwriter as good as Lennon and McCartney and the music he was writing, in the latter part of the Beatles. And I even loved Don't Bother Me. I thought that was a cool, different sounding song right away.
Oh, yeah. Very exotic.
It's exotic. It's like he was instantly and always trying to think differently. And again, necessity being the mother of invention, you're against McCartney and Lennon. You have to kind of figure out a way that you're going to do something. And it was a lot of negative feelings that George had about that because they weren't particularly encouraging, and George Martin wasn't particularly encouraging. So he really had to persevere. But man, you have basically an amazing songwriter adding things to your song.
Right.
And I Love Her. And obviously we're going to get to it. We Can Work It Out, which is another acoustic Beatles song. And, George is the one who suggested the waltz time.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And what a nice bit of musical coloring it is to that, to sort of this little breakdown within the song, which it really sort of evokes the theme of the song. Life is very short and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friend. You have this sort of breakdown there that sort of snaps you into awareness of, the risk of not working things out. Jumping to that song is a perfect example of ultra collaborations, because it's really the 3 of them, because Paul has his argument versus, and then John has the opposite point of view, is that life is very short, and then George is coming up with the timing and the different sound for that. So again, it just doesn't get better than that. Yeah, it's funny because when you really think about the words Paul is singing, it's really sort of adolescent. Agree with me or else. Where John, when he enters the bridge, it's this much more mature adult perspective. The bigger picture there, It's almost like the conscience, the angel on his shoulder or something like that. And then, you add the musical structure that, George contributed to. It's just an amazing piece of work that really stands up. If you didn't have those other two contributions and Paul had done it on his own, it would have been much more slight of a song, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, they helped each other with those middle eights, always making a huge difference and just this huge change in there. And you're right about Paul, is that Paul did have a tendency, and it also comes out, I think, on Fixing a Hole. And so, I love the way those things come out. Just like I love the way in Paul's songs you can kind of follow the relationship with Jane Asher, that he wanted her to be around all the time. So even in a sweet song like Here, There, and Everywhere, it was about, to live, but I need my love to be here.
Yes.
We have lost the time that was so hard to find when you won't see me. And it was constantly this thing where the Beatles were super busy, and then he had a little bit of time off. And this is very typical of show business, by the way. The instant you get time off, if your partner's in show business, they instantly get something that takes them away. So the 1 week you're looking for, I just got a job, I'm going to be in Wales, and it would drive him crazy because he really just wanted someone that was just going to be there all the time. And he got that in Linda. They were never apart for 30 years besides the Japan incident.
Right.
And that worked for him. It actually was right. It actually was what he needed, and he knew that. And, Jane was very interested and so strong and wanted to have her own career, and that's exactly what she did, and she did great.
Yeah. I think their time, ultimately, besides the great tunes that she inspired, which most of which aren't straight-up love songs, they're more tunes of aggravation or disharmony, but she played her part in the education of him as well, which was very, very useful for us as Beatle fans, turning him on to so many things, culturing him in a way that he hadn't been before.
That's really true. Moving in, with them, and then Peter being around, and they opened the bookstore, and, they go to all those cultural events, and he was just learning so much about classical music from, her mother. And it was just, he was like a sponge. I mean, the Beatles were all like that. They're, that's what smart people are. They don't think they know anything. They want to learn everything, and they're never done learning. They're just constantly, whenever you meet the smartest people, the smartest people are always the most curious. They always, and in any situation they're in, anywhere with anyone, they're trying to learn something new. They're not trying to just tell you what they know. They're trying to actually get something new and continue to grow. And the Beatles were like that, cubed.
And that's the story of their musicality. You listen again and again. Thank God we got these outtakes through anthology and through other means where we hear the initial drafts of certain things that they completely rethought, because in the hands of another artist, it might have been enough. It's like, okay, we've done a song that sounds like this. We can do another one because the public liked that. But that was not satisfying to them. They did not like repeating triumphs. They had to keep going. And it is to their credit, and it's to our benefit that we get to hear some of these outtakes. Hearing that anthology version of I'll Be Back in Walt's time, where they're trying to do something a little bit different. And, they would certainly return to that later. Come the next album, they've got Babies in Black. But for I'll Be Back, they recognize it's not quite working. And then they do the straight-up 4/4 thing with the finished version.
And, in addition to the time being wrong, they also realized the instrumentation was wrong. And similar to And I Love Her, it became went from a hard electric song to an all-acoustic song.
Yes.
And really, again, fantastic guitar work. And you just hear the rhythm guitar change and do different things throughout that song so that it's always interesting. Them playing acoustically and with their harmonies, it's just a beautiful, beautiful sound. I mean, again, it's, one of the things amazing about the Beatles is you have John and Paul, who both had amazing, great, soft balladeer voices. And then both of them can completely change their voices and become the most insane rock voices you've ever heard. I mean, that's not normal. That's not, there's nothing really to compare that to.
To have that skill set all in the same group. Also, the two of them singing harmony together and blending so beautifully. I mean, what a gift to have that versatility. And coupled with everything else that we know about them, their intellectual curiosity, their body of musical influences. Anybody trying to recreate the Beatles, you never could, because it was such an unbelievably unique combination of everything. And, we can sit here and analyze this stuff and can see, well, this is a reason for this and this is a reason for this. But even if we come up with a sum of parts, it's still there's still the magical aspect to the whole thing that you're never going to be able to recreate in any form. But boy, you can sure see it at work, especially when you listen to these outtakes and you hear them working through stuff and recognizing when something's not working that might have been perfectly good for somebody else.
It is, and one of the things we haven't mentioned, I know you've mentioned in other shows, Liverpool itself was such an influence because it was so connected to the United States. And I think, someone mentioned it's more connected to the U.S. than London was. Mm-hmm. And so they were really getting all the American music coming in, and just all that influence was there. So they just had this amazing, amazing cooker of every kind of music that was going on in America. But you needed the vessels that were John and Paul and George and Ringo to then be able to take that information, because lots of people were getting that stuff. But these are the guys that got really excited about it and got into it, and then in addition had insane talent to write it, to create it, and then perform it. I mean, it's amazing when you have this level of writing mixed in with this level of a singer, mixed in with this level of a musician on various instruments. I mean, it's just, as I said, it's the magic. And every day the Beatles doesn't happen again, you realize how special it was and how lucky we were to be living through it, or, getting to experience it close by if you haven't exactly lived through it.
Right. When you talk about the American influence, there's always, the grass is always greener. So things that might have been considered old hat or just, kind of mundane, commonplace things in America because you've heard it to death, it's fresh to them. And they take it and they're excited about it, and they imbue whatever it is they're working on with the excitement that they're getting from these influences and presenting it and making it their own. So you've got that joy. I think as you said in the last show you were on, where it just, you listen to it, it makes you smile.
It does. There's almost all Beatles music is like on the edge of laughter. Even the really sad songs, when you get to hear, as you're saying, when you get to hear the entire takes, you hear them crack up at the end or make a joke at the end, do something very moving. They're either saying something funny right before they sing it or saying something funny right after they sing it, no matter how intense it is. It's not like there had to be silence in the studio as the artist recovered from what he did. They were able to do it all. They were able to be amazingly emotional and real and killer and also hilariously funny on either side of that. It's like, again, it was all the energy about everything was encompassed in everything. I'm not trying to slag any of the groups off at the time and around the Beatles, but when you listen to it now and you hear the other music that was going on, anytime you say, oh, here's a Beatles song from that year, here's someone else's song from that, they sound years behind. Not only in their musicianship a lot of times, but in the way it's recorded and the way it's arranged. It's just like you said earlier, it's like they went with the first version of the arrangement. There wasn't a lot of experimentation. They just did it the way every other group did it. It was the same combination of guitars and drums and bass. And then you hear the Beatles, and there's just all these little tricks and jokes and, within the way they're playing their instruments, the way they're recording their instruments, almost from the very beginning. And it just was so apparent at the time. It was amazing. The
people that did have control of their artistic destiny that were working alongside the Beatles, I think of a Brian Wilson or Bob Dylan, somebody like that who was definitely much more in a position to call their own shots. The people we consider to be the peer groups, I think it's for that very reason, that they had that control, they had that vision, they had an artistic destiny they were pursuing that was really in spite of what was the commercial demands that might have been placed upon them. You can't underestimate how the Beatles' success so early on out of the box really helped nurture them in a way that if they had to slog away and take what was handed to them, they might not have flourished and flowered as early as they did. Success certainly gave them this platform from which to really call their own artistic destiny with a George Martin and not your typical producer of the day, really enabling them as they developed.
Again, everything that happened to them was sort of the perfect luck. To get George as their producer, George Martin, who was as curious and as excited as they were. And to give the Beatles credit, even from the very beginning, it is a hilarious story how they basically were just barely signed and just rejected everywhere, including EMI, until their second chance. And, they came in that first time and weren't particularly impressive, with their music and everything, and really impressed everybody more up in the control room as personalities than they did musically.
Right.
And so they're just getting by the skin of their teeth. And yet And this is part of the power of coming out of a place like Liverpool, and the power of John Lennon and the power of Paul McCartney and the belief in themselves enough to say, we want to write our own stuff. We don't want to do, which is that song, How Do You Do It, is a perfectly good song. I always liked that song.
Mm-hmm.
But to turn down almost a definite number one, to say we'd prefer to do our own stuff. When you've just gotten in there, it's not like, everyone is bidding on you or
right.
anything. It was amazing. It was amazing. And then, even so they get Love Me Do out, which again, acoustic song, they get that out. And it's really up to Brian and everybody to get that song to go as high as it went, to 17 or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And that barely happened. That wasn't going to happen on its own. That was also it got to that level by the skin of its teeth.
Right.
And it's sort of that success of that song, or relative success of it, is what started to get George Martin more interested. He started to take a bit more notice from that point. And then, the combination of Please Please Me coming back much quicker and everything. And now, he said, oh, this is a good song. It's going to be your number one and it sounds great and all that. But, that was a climb. It's just like nothing was easy, and it could have fallen apart in 12 different ways at any moment, and yet it didn't. I mean, it was so lucky that happened. And then, as you said, once they got successful, a lot of people, they freeze when they get successful, and they don't want to change. I mean, it's an enormous amount of pressure that, once you get to the top, everybody goes, isn't it great to be at the top? The artists I know that get to the top, all they worry about is falling off of that. It's an amazing thing. If you have a number one film or you have a number one record, you feel great. But then if you get a number two record, which is an enormous success, you feel like you failed because your last record was number one. So even though in the eyes of almost everybody else, you're incredibly successful and they might not be watching this kind of level of ridiculous detail, you're upset about that. You don't want that to happen. So you do anything you can to stay in that position. You go, what did I do that made that successful? This is the worst thing you can do, by the way. What sound did I do? How did I write? What was in that film that made that work? And that's the worst thing you can do. And the great thing is the Beatles didn't care. They just were interested. Well, we're tired of this. We can't keep doing that. That's built into their DNA, that they would get sick of what they were doing. They got sick of themselves and would always be pushing forward to try and do something else. And they sort of just didn't care. I mean, I think part of them felt that it was going to fall apart anyway. And, so what do they have to lose, And instead, it just got better and better.
Well, that's a really interesting point of being in that position of success and how it's not all it's cracked up to be, because suddenly you are under even more pressure to sustain your position.
John Lennon has a lot of self-loathing, and you can see that through the songs. And self-loathing, by the way, can be a fantastic thing. And, John is a perfect example of that because it keeps you growing. You're constantly kind of running away from yourself and reinventing your work. And so that was, always his philosophy was to, just burn everything he just did and move on to something else. And that also happens with people that self-loathe themselves. So they can often think that they're amazing, but then they also think they're the worst. And he hated the sound of his own voice, which is one of the most amazing voices in music history. But he hated the sound of it. That's one of the reasons that they developed a lot of these technical processes on his voice, is because he didn't like to sound like himself. Mm-hmm. So, again, it just all pushed the Beatles to constantly be innovating and constantly be doing something else, because he would get bored or dislike what they were doing all the time. And that kind of thinking kind of infested all of them in the most positive way. And again, it's a very powerful thing. So for all those reasons, they were able to stay together and really be a group that loved each other and get through all this pressure thing, through the humor and through the love and then through the self-loathing, continue to innovate instead of get frozen, because it's the last thing he could ever do. He could never embrace who he was at the moment. He was always looking ahead to be somebody else, and therefore the Beatles had to look ahead to be something else too.
Right. And conversely, you see them post-Beatles when they don't have that sort of built-in safety net or motivating force. The self-loathing is there and you still have the swings between the extremes, but it's not the same dynamic on their own because they're not being challenged within the group the same way, nor that they have the supporting team that is willing to take their raw material and make it into something else that really elevates it and just fuels that sort of fire. You don't have that anymore.
It's such an important thing to have people around you that you consider to be equal, to give you feedback, and that you're trying to impress and they're trying to impress you, and you give, constructive criticism and constructive help. And what is, typical in human relationships is that people just, I don't know what that is, but we get sick of each other. It's like familiarity breeds contempt. And, it's a funny thing. Like, if you were in a group and Paul McCartney came in with a new song, it's Paul McCartney, and he comes in with these beautiful new songs. And, toward the end of the Beatles, they wouldn't like them. Obviously this was happening to George all the time. But Paul comes in with something like Junk or something like that, which is a beautiful tune. I mean, it's as good as any Paul McCartney tune there is. And instead, the Beatles are into it. They're mocking it. John is mocking it or making fun of it or, whatever. That's what starts to get in your head. I've had about enough of this. All those songs from the first few Beatles albums after they broke up are Beatles songs, and and they were written in and around the influence of that irritation of the Beatles, and so they were great. And then after that, everybody had their own path to follow, and would go up and down. But yeah, it was great to see George come back with that, and his collaboration with Jeff Lynne, was just fantastic. And that was a full circle because Jeff Lynne was so Beatle influenced, and it's really fun to listen to that stuff.
Yeah, I have to think that it was like a breath of fresh air to the other guys as well, who were all coming from different situations that might have grown tiresome for them. Jeff, clearly with ELO, he was doing different things. He'd moved on from that at that time. Tom Petty, was recording his first solo album, away from the Heartbreakers. Dylan and Orbison maybe were on different paths, but they never really had the collective thing in a way that the other guys had before. So they all had something to really look forward to in joining together that was guaranteed to be pretty egoless because of the guys involved.
Yeah, and I think they kind of had rules on how they were going to work together and also how quickly they would work together. I think they were all sick of things taking so long in the studio, and they did all these things so fast, and it was just about having fun and not playing any of those games. And, again, it worked really well. It was in itself an amazing thing. Each Beatle, being, like I said, an amazing genius in their own right, George went off and, not only did he do great music after the Beatles, but then, his influence in film and then the Traveling Wilburys later and his own solo projects, incredible. I mean, it's just, his career in and of itself is just without, even forgetting the Beatles is just a stunning career, just even post-Beatles.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's one that over time is going to get more and more discovered because I think it's still fresh to a lot of people because it wasn't like he was saturating the airwaves, like a Wings was during the 70s or, other people that their stuff is just so out there. It's like you don't even feel the need to buy it because it's just constantly in the air. I mean, his stuff, I think, takes a certain level of maturity to get into because he wasn't striving for hitting over the commercial fences. He was just making music. I think once he got All Things Must Pass out of his system, I'm convinced that he was making music more or less for himself and wasn't feeling the need to compete with his peers. I think he was doing things that were pretty idiosyncratic, and every once in a while he'd get the urge to be a bit commercial, like 33 1/3 or Cloud 9. But for the most part, I think he just wanted to do what satisfied him. And if people liked it, great. And if they didn't, so what?
I think that's true, though at the same time, I'm sure he would get a certain amount of feedback from the record industry at that time, which was, changing up to an extent where they would get feedback about the sales and stuff. Again, it's that thing of, no matter what you're trying to do, almost every artist that I know that cares one way or the other and really cares about their art, it's difficult to hear if your sales are not there, if the audience isn't coming with you. Because, part of being a performer is you want to connect. They desperately really do want to connect and have their stuff appreciated. So it was a challenge. It's a challenge when something doesn't work. No matter what your past success was, you're only as good in your head as your last thing. And, so it's but he did great. As I said, he went through difficult times that didn't connect as much. And then he connected hugely. And you could see how thrilled he was about that and that it meant so much to him. It's I mean, it's the same thing with McCartney. You know, we always think of these people as being, you know, so successful that you don't have to do anything after the Beatles. You don't have to do anything after Pepper, you know, but it's not true. They really care because they are such terrific performers. You know, part of being a great performer is desperately caring what your audience thinks, you know, and no matter how much you're just trying to, you know, just do what's in your heart, you still then put it out there and go, what do you think? And if it's not great news, it hurts, you know. It's you know, a challenge for all of them. And the same thing, you know, you saw Lennon struggle the same way, and he was having such a terrific comeback right at the end there, sadly. And the caring about it was always there with all of them, you know. And it's part of why they're so much fun to watch, because they're not people that phone things in.
No, they never were. I do think that George required it probably less than the rest of them did. I mean, Paul, it's fairly obvious even from the Beatle days how much he needed an audience. He just fed off of it. You know, it didn't matter if there was one or two other people in the room. He would still perform for you, as you witnessed firsthand when you went to record him for The Simpsons.
Yes.
But, you know, that's just who he is. Ringo, I think he gets enough attention to keep his ego floating. I think John certainly felt when he was out of favor during the 70s, and then when he had the big comeback in 74 with Walls and Bridges and the duet with Elton John, he gets at his first #1, which took him that long to do. You know, he felt that love when the garden shook when he walked out on stage. So he knew that the audience was going to be there for him, no matter how insecure he might feel on one day or another. With George, it's clear that the public adored him when he was willing to, you know, avail himself. You know, the Dark Horse tour was very complex, where he's trying to promote Ravi to the rock audience and make it this sort of East-West world music thing, which is way ahead of the curve. But he had this sort of disdain for the people that were expecting him to be Beatle George that didn't wear well with his audience. But, you know, once he got past that, once he bottomed out and bounced back, and all of a sudden he's Funny George again with 33 1/3 and the promos he's making and SNL and all that stuff, it shows the difference between when he's in a good place and a bad place. And I think you trace his ups and downs with the albums he puts out with how happy he is at any given moment. And certainly by the time of Cloud 9, where I think there was a certain sort of, I don't have to do this, but I'm going to do it, and it's fresh for me because Jeff Lynne is willing to share the production chores, and he blows everybody away. He might not have put those heavy expectations on himself commercially, especially after Gone Troppo had just kind of fallen out and not really done anything, mostly because he didn't do anything to promote it. But suddenly he's blowing away Paul and has, you know, the last solo Beatle #1 in the U.S. charts with Got My Mind Set on You. And it must have been extremely gratifying, but at the same time, I think a little bit went a long way with him. You know, he tours Japan, but he doesn't tour here. It's like, okay, I got it out of my system again for however next many years. But unfortunately, he ran out of time before the wheel turned again.
I think that's very true, that probably he was the one that fame was kind of tough on, and that he didn't mind being out of the public eye. He liked living a private life, and it could overwhelm him pretty quickly. Like you're saying, he could get his fix pretty quickly and then not need any more after that.
Yeah, it is something that you hear the descriptions from, you know, like Tom Petty, somewhere I'd read, had said that, you know, if you slammed a car door in front of George, he would jump out of his skin. Like, it was almost like a PTSD, the whole effect years after the fact that Beatlemania took on him. You know, he just didn't have the same temperament of, you know, a Paul who would happily stand there and sign autographs all day for whoever's swarming him as he's trying to have a meal somewhere, you know. George just wasn't built for that.
It's true. It was overwhelming for him, probably the most of all of them. It took him a while to make friends with that, if he ever did 100%. But yeah, it was a challenge.
Yeah, but, you know, at least we have what we have, and it's very satisfying to know that up until the end, he was still making wonderful music. It's too bad he didn't get to enjoy Brainwashed, because I think it was a real high for him in terms of songwriting and production. And, you know, he, as you said, never phoned it in. It was a really worthy piece of work to go out on.
The Blackbird rehearsals, have you heard them? This is about 40 minutes of him working on Blackbird. Here's what goes on this 40-minute going through Blackbird rehearsals and talking about it. You hear John come in. You hear John tune up his guitar trying to play along. And John yells out to Paul, "What key is it in, really?" Because if you try and play along to Blackbird, it's instantly like all over the place. You know, it's G, but it just instantly just runs away from that. You know, you can't play normal chords with it. You have to, you know, do what it's doing. John then tries to play piano with it. You hear a discussion between Paul and George Martin and John about what to do about the song. I cannot recommend this 40 minutes more to any Beatles fan if you can find it. The thing that's amazing about this is that you're hearing the Beatles at definitely height of their creativity. You hear how sweet John is to Paul. You know, there's a lot of talk about the difficulties on the White Album, but there's so much time, and the Beatles are incredibly supportive and sweet with each other.
Mm-hmm.
You know, George Martin saying, well, I'm not trying to get a master recording here. I'm just trying to get an idea of what I want to do with the song. And you hear John say, well, that song, just as it is, just that the guitar is great. You know, you don't need anything else. You know, as long as it doesn't get boring, that's all you need. Even if it's only like a minute or 2 minutes or something, that's all you need. So he's advocating for it to just be the simple guitar, which was not, you know, that was not determined yet. And then you actually hear Paul say, yes, you just get this sound crystal clear. He's just talking about his guitar sound. And, you know, that's really all it is. And then John later, he's up on the booth and he's encouraging Paul as he plays, similar to the way you hear Paul encourage John when they're doing Julia.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They both do these American accents of the American artist and an American producer. Well, that was so great, man. That was the best one I ever heard. You know, that kind of thing. And they're fooling around with each other like that. And then you also hear John say, he says, okay, let's, you know, when they're discussing it with George, he says, here we go, dim the lights a bit, get out of the factory. And you hear Paul goes, yeah, I do feel like I'm in the factory a bit. and you know, so they're just talking about how to get it. And then in going through this rehearsal, Paul will suddenly start playing on acoustic guitar, Helter Skelter. He'll start playing a song you never heard that never ever became a song before. And then you hear John having a conversation with George Martin about Revolution 9 and talking about it. He says, I know there's a bit that it just goes on too long, and there's this boring bit. And I know where the boring bit is, and I think it's the same place you think is a boring bit, and we're just going to cut that out and put something else in. You know, and again, when you hear these great artists, the greatest artists of the 20th century talk, they didn't talk in any like high, huge falutin terms. They would just say, well, that's boring. This is simple. You know, it's just using very basic language to really get to the essence of what they were doing. You know, they were not full of themselves in the way they would talk about things.
Yeah, it's almost like in code when you're listening to these conversations because they understand their language between them, but it's not technical or developed in a way that most outsiders would understand what the hell they mean. Exactly.
And I'm an advocate, and you know, whenever I get with the Apple people, you know, the people I know over there, I'm always saying at some point, whenever it is, you have to release whenever tape was rolling. You have to release everything. You know, however much it's going to cost to sell it, there's going to be people that are interested in that. And there's going to be certainly historians that are interested in that because we have a lot of information about the painting of the Sistine Chapel. It's like being in the room when that's happening and watching the details and how they get those effects and how those conversations go. It's fascinating. I mean, you know, it's not for everybody. It's for people that maybe, you know, are interested in this. It's not every single person. Lots of people just want to hear the song. They don't want to see how it's made, you know.
Right.
They don't want to know how sausage is made, but there's a lot of people that do. And it's the idea of getting to see this art come together. As I said, so, you know, as Paul's working on Just Blackbird, you hear him working on Helter Skelter. You hear him working on a song that didn't happen. You hear them talking about Revolution 9. You hear how they're getting the mood for that song. It's just an explosion of creativity, multiple things happening at once, you know, all going, you know, at the same time. And you just, you know, you would kill to be a fly on the wall with something like that. And I don't know how much of that is out there, but there's a lot more than what we've heard.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very, very informative about creativity and about how things can happen and gives you certain guidelines, you know, in your own work and your own projects about one of the greatest lessons from the Beatles is don't sweat it, have fun. And when you're relaxed and you're having fun and you're just doing your joy, that's going to then, you know, channel the greatest creativity that you can find.
And the joy will be evident in the final product.
It will. You know, it is amazing. And I've seen everything. I've seen things that come from nothing but hand wringing and panic and, you know, very bad vibes. And still what you see turns out to be great. But it's not necessary. It might be necessary for certain people, I guess. That might be the process. But that's very sad. The Beatles are proof that an enormous amount of insanely greatest art that ever occurred can come out of pure joy and having a good time and having a laugh.
Even the Let It Be sessions, which we have documented, the finished film might not be reflective of all the joy and the happy moments that did happen, but they're there. You get glimpses of it here and there, but you listen to the session tapes, and for all the dysfunction going on and the passive aggression, you do get these moments where they are back in Liverpool, those kids, having joy, sharing a joke or sharing some musical discovery. And I think that's something that really, despite what you see on the outside, really did carry through their relationships till they stopped working together.
And you're absolutely right about Let It Be stuff. The stuff that isn't in the movie, they're laughing and fooling around and having so much fun. And the movie was definitely edited in a way, distilling down the fact that they were heading toward the end. But just as humans are complicated, there was enormous amounts of joy around in there, and enormous amounts of chemistry that just, are joyful to watch, at the same time. And that's part of my plea to Apple, is that all the Let It Be film needs to be released so that, when you get a Blu-ray of it, sure, you can see the original film, and then you can have 12 hours of extras that show everything else. Because, the more I've studied, I will admit it, I have one of those bootlegs that came in the thing that looked like a film can, and it's just an enormous amount. It's probably like 10 discs of Let It Be stuff. Mm-hmm. And I would play it when I was younger, and I would go, this is pretty boring, But the more I study the Beatles, the more like every little snippet I hear things that now inform other things, and they entertain me now. So I like every moment, because there's always something in there that I can take from it or get inspired from. An interesting thing about the two of us, and this would have been like a discussion as we went through all the other songs too, it's right on the edge of not being acoustic, because a very interesting thing, and I'll have to bring up one other song because it's so interesting, but a very interesting thing is, like, I'm always kind of giving the electric bass a pass in terms of calling a song acoustic, because, it's just a way to hear the bass, and it's not really an electric guitar, it's an electric bass. Mm-hmm. But in the case of the two of us, there's no electric bass on the two of us. It's actually George playing his Fender Telecaster.
Yes.
And so technically it's an electric guitar on that thing, though he's making it sound like a bass.
Right.
So I just want to say that for the nitpickers out there. Last time I was on the podcast, there was like 40 people outside my front door, like pointing out my mistakes and everything. I don't know how they know where I live, but they do. So I just don't want to get in a lot of trouble for that.
Okay. Duly noted.
The one other song, since we're just jumping, which I want to bring up just because to see if you know this, or if anybody knows this. When I first heard the song, great acoustic song, I Will, and I would hear that on the White Album. And I was going, that's the weirdest bass I've ever heard. It's Paul McCartney doing the bass with his mouth.
Yep.
And I could not figure that out as a kid. It just sounded like a very kind of slap-tuned bass that was slightly out. And I was amazed, and I still remain amazed, that they left that on the song, because that song is an incredibly complex set of changes. It's really beautiful. It is really a terrific song. And yet to kind of have, in a way, a comedy bass line on it in some ways is just stunning. I mean, again, it just shows that they just did not, they didn't care what kind of experiment they did. They just went for it. It's like to just throw a song out like that's that great, and say, I'm just going to try and do mouth bass on it, and that'll be that. Amazing to me.
Typical Beatles subversion.
It is. And I would say, there isn't a Beatles album I could ever say negative things about, but I just love the White Album, which is, people, particularly when it first came out, it was so big, and there's always been this talk like, oh, if we cut it down, it would have been a great album, and maybe it was too long. I think it's kind of perfect the way it is. And I think it has the greatest differences in the music, the greatest diversity of any album they did. And it's called The Beatles. So it really does kind of describe the Beatles, which is maximum diversity. It's the most acoustic album and the most electric album simultaneously. And then you have Revolution 9 in there. So it's also the most experimental album in that sense. It just does every form of music, and so well in every form of music.
It's funny because it was my own observation, but then I read a quote from Ringo, like a latter-day observation of his, where he had said something like he saw the White Album as being more the follow-up to Revolver than Pepper was, because he says, with Pepper, we got all the madness out of our system, but the White Album, that was us playing as a band again. And that was what he really enjoyed. And he really saw that more as a Revolver follow-up, because superficially, at least, they've got a lot of commonalities. The diversity, the more, playing as a rock band and not this sort of artifice like it's a stage musical or something. It really is them as a four-piece band, even songs with strings on it or whatever. It's them across a variety of textures expressing themselves as Beatles, as a band.
It's true. As fun and amazing, and it never stops being an amazing thing to me, as Pepper is, you do something like that. It's like going from an art film where there's just people in a room interacting with each other to shooting an enormous Star Wars film or an enormous Marvel superhero film. Technically, you have to shoot everything in tiny little pieces. And it's not super fun for the people doing it. And Pepper is like that. It's like it's recorded. I mean, actually, it was really fun to listen to the Pepper sessions because you hear them play as a band before they put everything on it. When you hear like the 100-minute thing that comes with the deluxe Pepper thing, you hear the original tracks and them playing as a band. But then it was very, very tedious adding all these little things here and there and that and this. And so, Ringo would come in and he would sit around for 7 hours and then he'd do like 5 minutes of drumming,
right.
And that is it. That is a challenge. That is a challenge. And that part of the reason that John, reacted against that, because it's fun to do that once. It would not be fun to keep, doing that constantly, because as a musician, you're not really jamming that much, or you're jamming at the very beginning of the project, but then you have 6 months of just doing these tiny little fixes and coming up with things. And, that it's a challenge to do that. And the White Album is much more of them as group, but also, as is always discussed, much more of them as solo artists too, doing things that are very. And While My Guitar Gently Weeps, that's one of my very favorite acoustic Beatles things. That take that George does, which I think is just take one with the guitar and a little bit of harmonium, is one of the most beautiful things. I mean, it blows me away every time.
It's amazing. Obviously, he had another vision for the song, but again, it's like a Strawberry Fields. If they put that out as an acoustic track on the album or something like that, I think everybody would have been totally satisfied with it. But it just works on that most organic of levels.
It does. And then the version with Clapton works too. It's like they didn't mess it up. It's just different. It's just like I love both Revolutions too.
Exactly.
It's like, there's such a wealth of material with them, and the songs are so strong. You hear different versions of them and they're still great.
Yeah. With John, especially in the later Beatle years and post-Beatles, where his sensibility and values were more directed at what he termed authenticity, you could see him reacting against a Pepper or even that kind of approach to anything ever again, because to him it wasn't real. And he loves the White Album because it's a lot more personal. The songs he wrote in Rishikesh, almost sort of underproduced, but to my ears it's like produced exactly as it should be. I wouldn't have wanted to see more done with it. Also, there's the whole aspect of him seeing Pepper as more Paul's baby than his baby, and therefore he's going to project his disdain toward it.
It's true. And I always, with him, I always take it with a grain of salt, because he just always has a tendency to, attack anything that he's done afterwards. He's I can't remember the song that he does live. If it would ever get through the night, I can't remember what it was, but right at the end of the song, before the song is even faded out completely, he says, "We'll get it next time."
Instant karma at 1-to-1.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly
right.
And so that's John's personality, in a nutshell. I mean, obviously we keep hearing it. It's a great version of Instant Karma. It's just fine for a live performance. It has so much energy. It's fun. And then, he's instantly like backing away from it.
Right.
And, John was also hilarious in the sense that if you went up to John and you said, Pepper was such an overproduced piece of shit, he'd go, "You shut up." That's like,
right.
He would defend. He loved to put down the other Beatles, but he wouldn't let anybody else put down the other Beatles. It's like he was just a contrarian is what it is.
Yeah.
There's people like that. They have to react to the negative of whatever's being said. Pepper, for what it was, is still stunning. It's like it stands on its own as its own thing. When you're interested in production, there's still virtually nothing that's ever touched it. I mean, it's you listen to it and all the instruments are done in a way that are hard to recognize and that you sort of never heard before. And they're all done in a way too that adds to the joy that I was talking about. I mean, all the chord progressions on that album are these amazing, joyful things, and it's just fun. I mean, it's not that it has to be the deepest album. It is just joyful. It is a really hard thing to do, like an album that is just this amazing joy and just this happiness, or there's some bittersweet in there too, but it's generally happy and sweet and good and positive and laughter. It's an amazing thing. Like it's as I said, I celebrate almost every Beatles album as the best Beatles album ever, and particularly in their period, within their moment, it was the right thing for the moment.
Pepper is playful and nostalgic. So you have those things going for it too. And the whole McCartney aspect, come and see the show. It's very inclusive. Like, come on, everybody, which is very much a Paul trait.
Well, the thing that's, you bring up an interesting point, because it's supposed to be a live performance. If you're doing a live performance, particularly in those days and at those times, you wouldn't do a shitload of songs about death.
Right.
You're trying to get the audience all going through the roof with energy and happiness. When people sort of say, oh, the songs aren't related, they kind of are, in the sense that they almost all work perfectly in a live feeling of trying to get an audience up, to trying to get an audience excited. Whereas Revolver is an album that gets you thinking, that gets you more internally going on. Live performances weren't so much about that at that point. Obviously it happened with the singer-songwriter and the, Joni Mitchell and James Taylor kind of thing, as Joni says in her song, getting them to feel like that, which was much more of an introspective, bittersweet thing. But, the rock and roll time and the Beatles time of performing was all about just people screaming and never stopping. And so Pepper kind of encompasses that. But, I always see everything, like I said, in and of its time, in and of its moment, and how it looks now. Pepper was the perfect answer to Revolver, because it was, again, saying we can do Revolver and now we can do this. And then White Album is the answer to that. Now we can do this. It's like it never ended. It's like it was always changing. Each was its own thing, I mean, again, when you're talking acoustically too, and talking about Rubber Soul in the United States was an amazing breakthrough in a way that it wasn't in England, because of the horrible way they pulled songs off of it. They actually kind of, somewhat accidentally, somewhat on purpose, made it the first folk rock album.
It's one of those hindsight observations that people make, and certainly there's something about the American collation of Rubber Soul that works as a cohesive whole. If you have nothing else, some people were blasphemous, how dare you, that's not the way the Beatles intended it. But you know what? It was the American one that inspired Pet Sounds. So there's no contesting that.
I find what they did to be heinous, creatively. I'm totally against, what they did in theory. But it's an amazing thing, Drive My Car. People love that song. I mean, and I think it's fun, but it's kind of a novelty comedy song. I mean, they go beep, beep. I mean, it's not particularly deep. Like, to me, you could have Drive My Car 2 albums earlier and it would fit completely.
Right.
Really, again, sort of the amazing breakthrough that was really happened in England happened on Help. Because Help had Yesterday on it, which, again, you have to take it in context. Yesterday was such a successful song, and I think it still may be the most covered song in history. That hurt it in a way, because it became so ubiquitous, and there were so many horrible, horrible covers of it. But when you get to the original song and what it is, it's an amazing song. It's just kind of overheard and had its thing. And then also, I've Just Seen a Face is on the Help album. And that's another amazing, just that opening guitar piece that leads into it. It's just right away. They won't do a normal kind of country and Western sound. They figure out a different way to twist the opening, and then also even to twist the rhythm in the way they're doing it. And kind of has chords in it that you don't normally hear in a country song, but yet it has a country feel. And so there's this stuff going on. So the fact that you would, in America, you put on Rubber Soul, if I had heard Drive My Car first, that would have given me an entirely different point of view of that record.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, completely, because there's nothing acoustic about it. Instead, you put it on, and you instantly hear that amazing, weird opening of I've Just Seen a Face.
It sounds like no other Beatle recording. It is so unique.
No other Beatles. And as an acoustic guitar nut, crazy person like me, you're just blown away by this great acoustic thing happening. And then you figure, all right, we got an acoustic song. That's pretty cool. What's going to happen next? It goes into Norwegian Wood. And so you're still full acoustic, and you have sitar in there and amazing. And again, the genius of the Beatles in doing Norwegian Wood, the original versions of that, the early versions, are much more like a comedy song. They're much more like a Peter Sellers comedy song from that kind of time period. They were almost going to go with that, and then they completely did a remake and turned it into something like ultra cool that you'd never heard before. It's got comedy in the lyrics and everything, but the music is deadly serious. There's nothing in the music to tell you that it's funny.
Right.
And that's always the most powerful comedy. I always believe that, let the audience discover the comedy. Don't let the music try and tell you that something's funny. That's insulting. I love the fact that you kind of figure that out as it goes along. And by the way, that was one of the songs that Paul was so excited about. He says, we started to write jokes into our songs. We're starting to put humor in our songs. And that was a big breakthrough for them to come up with these various things that were very tongue in cheek. And so you suddenly have this folk rock album, just those two songs really, it's those early songs of the record plus that cover, which is very organic colors. They're in the trees, and then John's wearing leather, like a suede. It's soft. And then you had I'm Looking Through You, which in the American version has the false start, which is funny because, Norwegian Wood, I'm sure you've heard the whole thing, it's got a false start too. It's got he tries it 3 times before he gets it right.
Yeah.
That opening riff. And then at the end he goes, I showed you. It's amazing that he said that they had to shut his vocal mic down really fast. So, that song fades out really quickly, or you would hear him say that. But yeah, so then and that sounded like so cool and organic to have, they're having like the beginning of the song in there, and them getting into it, them getting ready and making mistakes. So everything about it felt like this folk rock breakthrough that did not exist in England. And it was amazing the way that was different in America. To my mind, the one thing that might have been better, but I don't condone it still.
Right. Artistic tampering. But it does work. There's no denying.
It does work. And it looks like the cover is talking about it, and then, just all through the whole thing.
Yeah. Hell, George has got a cowboy hat on the back.
I know. It was so of the time. It was so, there did seem to be thought about it, but I don't know. Like I've read things that say that, that I'm Looking Through You, that was literally a mistake to have those beginning things on there like that.
I can't hear it any other way. It's so satisfying.
It's true. I was disappointed. I mean, do you know the other things that America did, because they also messed with the sound of their songs. Did you know that?
Yes.
We'll go back to I Feel Fine. The first time I ever heard it, it's got huge amount of echo in the United States.
Recorded at the cavern. A literal cavern.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. I love that sound of that gigantic echo. It made everything sound gigantic, and that was the only way I knew the song. And, when the CDs were coming out, you had to wait forever for that because it was not on the English version of the record, so you had to wait for past masters, which they put out, I think, at the end of all the CDs, didn't they? I think.
Yeah.
And I ran home with my past masters that had I Feel Fine on it. I put it on, and I was like, they completely fucked this up. There's no echo.
It's stripped.
Yeah, it's ruined. And, but that was the way it was intended. And, the other thing they would do on those early ones, and you particularly hear it on the Beatles' second album in America.
Yes.
They would put 3K. They would turn up the EQ at 3,000 hertz. And that would really make the cymbals and the drums just sizzle like you wouldn't believe. Like, shh. I mean, it would it make it like really shoot out of the radio at you, but it was almost grating when you listen to it now. But they would do that. They would re-EQ it in that way to kind of push that particular frequency.
Well, I remember back when I was first hearing the album, becoming a Beatle fan, that there was something it took me a while to put my finger on that was distinct with that album, the Beatles' second album. Besides the fact that it's so cover heavy, what they threw in there, it almost comes off like a fake live album. It's got this live sort of sensibility to it. It just sounds like a string of performances.
It is such an amazing burst of energy, that album. I mean, I remember that being very, very young and getting that record, and it was, it was like eating about a pound of sugar every time you listen.
Yeah, I mean, I've had the argument so many times with people about, the Beatles' intentions and the British being the standard and these American bastard collections that just, nobody should ever enjoy them. You're not allowed to because it's not what the Beatles wanted. But if you look at them as a series of compilations rather than artistic statements purportedly from the Beatles, they're fine. I mean, they're not so stupidly put together that you can't enjoy them. I think they all have a programming sense to them that works. I can't think of any one of them that I would think, oh, God, they shouldn't have sequenced this like this. Even Yesterday and Today, which is such a mishmash, it somehow works. And I don't know if that's just, the prejudice of having been exposed to it as a kid, and it just in my mind, it flows. But at least they had the good sense of the songs they took from Revolver all could work alongside Act Naturally and Nowhere Man, the other songs they had laying around. They were careful. Taxman was finished by the time they put that album together. And putting aside the point that they had already sort of designated as being the opener to Revolver, if you stuck that alongside any of the two guitar-based drum songs on Yesterday and Today, it doesn't really fit. There's something jarring and raw about it that doesn't have the same sort of vibe as some of the other stuff.
It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. I mean, Taxman, again, when you talk about Revolver, you get Revolver and, it's got that cool count and everything. But it's a really dark song that starts everything off.
Oh,
yeah. Right away everybody's angry and it's great. That's one of the reasons that Revolver is so powerful. It pulls no punches. It is really a super, super strong set of songs and performances. But it is the opposite of cuddly Beatles. And that was a challenge. It was like you guys have to grow with us. And again, it's not that they're doing it consciously, but they have this album which is sort of an attack, and then they follow it up with a hug of Sgt. Pepper, and then they follow it up with with the White Album that gives you a multiple things. There's hugs in there, but there's also things that are incredibly challenging at the same time. So it just always worked out. And in terms of you talking about putting the songs on these different albums and creating these kind of Frankenstein monsters, the simple thing, and I heard a great artist say this, Beatles songs, they're just indestructible.
Nothing is Beatle-proof.
You could just throw anything against the wall, and it's just all so good. And, sort of proves that to an extent is there's the All Beatles radio station going on now. Mm-hmm. And, we had that in Los Angeles 20 years ago, 25 years. There was an All Beatles radio station. I can't remember what it was. Mm. And I would think that, I can't listen to this all the time. And then you can't stop listening to it.
Right.
And, they're doing this on Sirius XM. And, a lot of times I vehemently disagree with a playlist order that I'm hearing. So that's a terrible grouping, and it seems to be completely random. I said, but at the same time, the songs are so good that you still get pulled into it. It's just, you can do it poorly, but the actual songs are so amazing that you can't really ruin how amazing they are, no matter what order you put them in or what you put them next to. It won't be the best, but it still works. And I think, as you said, and I think there's a whole book on the Beatles' second album, isn't there?
Yeah, Dave Marsh.
Yeah. And it's true that, they want, whether they're doing it consciously or not, and there's definitely some thought in there, they wound up with products that work on their own merit. Again, because the material's so strong, it's hard not to look like a genius. It's just hard.
Right. That's absolutely true.